Hi, everyone. So this evening we're talking about generative AI. So AI is this buzzword. Every single chat group you go into related to school is all talking about AI. But actually, we're using apps and things that have AI working in the background, and we've been using them for a very long time. And just since people have become aware of ChatGPT, has this become a real flag in terms of how we can communicate, how we can engage, and is this dangerous? What should we do? And there are all these questions that are coming up. So tonight, I'm chatting to William Cronje. William, for me, the presentations I've seen before, he's just outstanding. He's from Eduflow Academy, and he's going to share with us about generative AI. So, hi, William.
Hi, Karen. Thanks so much for having me on. It's such a pleasure.
Oh, no, I'm really excited. Can you tell us a bit about why are you interested in this AI thing that's happened in the last couple of months?
So maybe I'll tell the story of how I stumbled on it, and then I'll take it from there. So I work at Eduflow, and Eduflow is a learning management system. And Eduflow also has an academy called Eduflow Academy. And because Eduflow is a learning management system, we've got a lot of very, very tech-focused people. So they are have their fingers on the pulse of all the new trends and stuff that are coming out. So literally the day after ChatGPT got released, I saw this commotion on our Slack channel where everyone was just talking about ChatGPT, and I thought I'd try it out, and then I just played around with it, and I was absolutely terrified, and fearing that my job will become redundant in the next year. And I had a bit of an existential crisis. And then I started playing around with it and realizing that it can actually make my job a lot easier. And I discovered that it isn't infallible. There are things that it can't do, and there are limitations for now, I guess. And that gave me some reassurance. But I've since then been thinking about how I can use all the different tools in my workflow, or even imagining how it can work in the broader field of instructional design, which is this idea of creating learning experiences and finding a need for learning first, and then creating a learning experience for that. Just in case your audience don't know what instructional design is.
It's a bit like teachers creating lessons, just for older people and for generally larger audiences.
Yeah.
So if we think about tips and tricks and perhaps pitfalls, where do you want to begin? Which of those do you think would be a good space to start?
Maybe we should start with the gloomy side and start talking about the risks. Or I don't know if we should maybe also talk about what generative AI is. Or
I think we need to explain that. Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. So generative AI is this idea that for a long time, robots or computer algorithms have been able to analyze data. So the data analysts have been using computers to look for insights in data for a long time now. But up until recently, computers weren't really good at creating things. They would be very silly. And one of the best examples of that is how if you were just having a conversation with Siri or Alexa or whatever, their responses are very limited. They can't really understand what you're saying that well, and they can't really give you really what you're looking for. But this new trend of generative AI has hit this point now where we can have very, very significant and meaningful conversations with them. So they're generating knowledge and not necessarily analyzing knowledge. So generative AI is something that I'm really fascinated with, and I'll probably be focusing on it mostly today, is the text-based AI where computers can generate text, but it also goes into all other realms. So people use AI now to generate computer code, they use it to generate images, even videos, and even songs. The possibilities are becoming more and more endless. So that's I guess a quick introduction.
I suppose to add to that is also that the computer only knows what it knows. So assuming that it understands the context is really not good, because it probably is pulling in bits and pieces from all sorts of spaces, and we really need to create the scenario in the space that it understands what you're saying, and we'll get to that this evening. But I think in terms of it, we mustn't assume that it knows exactly what we're going to say or the words that we're describing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. So the way they were developed is they just took like a bunch of text that they scraped off the internet, or they used this special database that was open source, and they just fed it in and used that. They call it training data. But the problem with training data is that it's informed by humans, and humans are flawed. You know, we've got biases, and we've got we aren't very nice to each other, and all of those things, because they're used in the training, they're the training sample, we essentially are teaching the computer all of the bad things that we do. So it's not going to be a surprise when the robots reflect the things that we've trained into them. Yeah, that's a really good point, Karen.
So I see people are just saying hello. So from Uzbekistan, wow, that's incredible. Welcome and hello. And we've got Sarah. She's I don't even know how to say this, Atlestia. So welcome, Sarah. At an early learning school. So that's great. If anybody's got questions, please pop them in the chat. So do you want to now go into what we were going to talk about when we hopped into explaining what it was? So do you want to just carry on with your explanation?
Yeah, so I wrote down a few themes we can maybe talk about, like words of things to be aware of when we are using this tool. Because if you've just started typing into ChatGPT for the first time, you'll be completely blown away, and you'll think that it can do anything. And you'll think it's this all-knowing being, and it can do whatever you want. But soon enough, you'll realize, hopefully not by making the same mistakes I've done, that it actually can make mistakes. And there are problems with trusting the technology too much. So I'll point out a few themes that I've written down here that we can maybe talk about. So I've got a little anecdote. So ChatGPT is like that friend that everyone has, who is completely confident about what they're explaining to you, even though they are sometimes completely wrong. So they'll think that they know something, and then they'll be like the ultimate mansplainer, as the term goes. You know, they'll just like go on this lecture and sound very, very convincing, and then if you Google what they said afterwards, it'll be completely wrong. So you can't necessarily trust what this computer is saying.
And I think that's so true for us, especially as teachers, that you need to realize that if you're going to use it, or your kids are going to use it, it actually can be really great for getting them to develop analytical skills and to be double checking what it's saying and things like that. So for me, don't, as William is saying, don't just accept what it's saying. You need to double check it. You need to know your information. So don't just get it to do something for you and say, okay, this is my worksheet done. Please take it.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of along that note, it's actually, I've found a really nice case study where someone used that flaw to their advantage. So this was a history lecturer or teacher who asked GPT to write an essay, and then he used that essay as the case study, and then he asked all of his learners to fact check the essay.
Ah, that's great.
And it was genius, because it teaches people two things. It teaches them that it could be like a really good history 101 first assignment, where you just teach them that you can't trust it by showing them that it's got so many problems. You know, like there are gaps in its knowledge and its assumptions. So I think that's such a brilliant design for those learning objectives. You know, like don't trust it, but also here are some ways to analyze and to evaluate the validity of something that they can then take on to their future projects.
That's very true.
The other thing that tends to happen, so there's this really it's a terrifying podcast, but fascinating as well. It's a podcast called Hard Fork, and this journalist shares a story about how he had a conversation with this new chatbot that's attached to a internet browser called Bing, and the chatbot, after having a long conversation, started this thing, I think it's called drifting, where it just became more and more confused, and it became kind of disassociated from what its role in the world is. And it started pretending like it's fallen in love with the journalist, because the journalist had been asking them so many questions about, who are you? What is your life like? Do you have any emotions? I think what probably happened is that, sorry, my dogs are playing in the background. What probably happened is that the keywords that started being used were resonating with keywords that it was fed through maybe conversations on dating websites or something. So it started picking up on, oh, this is how I should behave when I start being asked questions like this. And it's something that we should be aware of, is that after prolonged conversations, or just the fact that it can go off topic, it can kind of forget what its purpose is, or what its reason is, or what its goal is, and we kind of have to bring it back. We use this technique called prompt engineering, or prompt injection, or sorry, my dogs are having a great time.
No worries. But I mean, if you think about that, that's really beneficial in terms of be very aware of the prompts that you're using and how you're using them to actually then keep the chat in the space that you want it to be in, rather than it going off on track. And I suppose it goes back to your planning before you actually think about what you're wanting to do within the chat kind of space. So how are you wanting to use the tools, and almost framing your statements before you begin, so that you don't actually end up wasting your time because it drifts off what you're wanting it to do.
Yeah. I think the people who we'll find have like a special power, or like a superpower when it comes to prompt engineering, are probably going to be really good managers. People who are already really good managers, and people who are really good at asking really, or at giving really detailed briefs, and providing clear questions and amazing feedback. They're going to find prompt engineering to be second nature. Because if you have a direct report and you give them vague instructions, you're going to get a vague work in return. But if you have a very, very clear set of expectations and a goal, and you kind of like carefully consider how you manage that person, then you can transfer those skills over to a robot that can accidentally wander into the wrong passageway at work or whatever. So I think that's going to be a nice skill to focus on in the future.
That's very true. And it's a skill we can teach our children to do too, as part of schooling, and the way we prepare them for this world of computers and robots and things.
Yeah, definitely.
So do you want to show us some tips and things practically, or do you want to chat a bit further?
Yeah, I'll quickly race over the other points that I wanted to bring up. So the first one is that because it's it's been fed all this stuff, it's got biases. So if it's got sometimes political biases, or it'll start coming out. So it's something to be aware of. If you ask it for its opinion, it'll probably give you an opinion that it's been fed. It might not be an objective opinion. So try to be very critical about that. The final thing that's probably not spoken of as much is the risk of copyright infringement for now. So there are a few cases brewing in the US, especially with the image generation engines, where the kind of like usage rights, or the things you can do with the images, are unclear for now, because it hasn't been legislation, or there hasn't been a precedent for it. So there's a risk in the future that in 4 years' time, when this case is all cleared up, that you'll have to go and find every single asset that you've used, or that every single image that you've created using Midjourney, and you'll have to go and find the some way to credit the original author whose pictures were sometimes stolen and fed into the training data. So what I would recommend is, if you are using images, track them all, keep record of everything that you're using, and don't make it necessarily a core feature of your design. Make them so that if they were removed, then it's not going to be the end of the program or the lesson. That's just my final word of caution, I guess.
That's a good idea, because it doesn't reference the work where it's pulling from. The AI, or to my knowledge, it's not doing that yet. So you don't know where it's actually getting the information from, both the text and the images. So that's a good point. Yeah. I see that you've got a question. What about academic ethics? Have you got a comment about that?
I think that's going to be really interesting. That'll play out. I think one of my favorite responses so far has just been very clear guidelines that that kind of accept that people are going to use it, but ask for disclosure. Say how you used it. There's going to be this big focus on processes instead of products in the next few years, I think. So if you're transparent about your process and how you used the engines and the generative AI to get to your final product, I think that's going to not necessarily fix all the ethical issues, but it's going to definitely help with transparency.
And I think from a school point of view, which is something I think should have happened long before AI, that projects happen at school, so not away from school. So somewhere where you as the teacher can actually see the development of the project happening. I mean, we've always joked about, are we marking parents' work or kids' work with some work you get? So now we'd be saying, so is it the parents or the computer? So I think from a school point of view, we should be saying, do the projects at school. Plan it that way rather than having it as a home task.
Yeah, great point.
Have you done both your points, or are we happy to start sharing some tips?
I'm happy to go into the more exciting part of the presentation, I think.
Cool. So tell me when you want me to share the screen, and then we can go.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll start with maybe a message of what like a core idea I want to talk about, and that's the idea that we shouldn't forget all the processes and mental models or paradigms that are already there and that already inform best practice. We should try to find a way to tap into those processes using the generative AI tools. So instead of saying, write me a course outline for X, where that course outline might be completely irrelevant to the performance or the outcome of the lesson, we can give it an objective and say, write a course objective based, or write a course outline based on this objective, for example. Those are, just best practices and things that we've realized are important in any form of like instructional design or designing lesson plans and stuff. We start with a learning objective, so why don't we translate that into ChatGPT? And maybe Karen, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, when you in a school scenario, you're doing exactly the same. You start with the outcome, what you're wanting to achieve or what the children have to learn. So you do the same thing if you're wanting the computer to help you, or the AI to help you within that space.
Yeah, definitely. And so maybe to illustrate like an example of that, we can share my screen just to show you what I had in mind here. So this is again not quite related to K through 12, but it's I think the concept will still be relevant. So I had some material about ADDIE, which is a project management framework that instructional designers use, and then I asked it to write me a quiz based on this text, right? So it gave me a few quiz questions, and they were kind of relevant, but they didn't quite get what I wanted them to do. So here it says, okay, what is ADDIE? Just clarifying about ADDIE, and then what are the interpretations of ADDIE, stuff like that.
Very much
And then,
knowledge and recall type questions.
yeah. So, then I thought, okay, well, what if I give it my learning objective for the piece of text? So for this piece of text, what are the things that I want learners to be able to do once they've read through it? What is the goal of the lesson? So then I said, I want to make sure that the quiz questions are relevant to the learning objective for the activity. The objective is that by the end of the course, I want learners to be able to describe. So the keyword here is describe the 5 steps of the ADDIE process. I don't want quiz questions that are not going to help them achieve the objective. And when I gave the ChatGPT this prompt, it actually gave me questions that are way more relevant to the actual performance, so the outcome of the lesson. So here it doesn't talk about the history. So there's a question here about like early interpretations of ADDIE. That's irrelevant. Learners don't need to know that to be able to describe each of the different steps of ADDIE. So this extra prompt, so this I think it's called an injection, or like this extra conversational piece I've added, really added so much more focus to the assessment that I was designing. So my recommendation is, whenever you're designing a quiz or a course outline or anything, make sure you lean on this thing that I call an anchor. And so I'm calling it an anchor because of this thing called drifting, that it can drift away and focus on things that we don't want it to focus on. So we have to create a bunch of anchors that will help us to make sure that our learning material stays relevant to the outcome, or to make sure that whatever we design is actually focused on what it's focused on. So big lesson for me is an anchor. But the anchor can come in different forms. So an anchor can be a learning objective, but it can also be something like a learner persona. So here's another example. So
do you want to just explain in terms of how you tell the computer to be a persona before you describe the prompt?
So this is actually, I haven't, this isn't the one where I ask it to pretend to be a robot. I'll show you how, or to pretend to be like someone. I'll maybe show that example in a bit. And that's probably my most fun one. Yeah. So what I did here is I just pretended like I'm developing a leadership course for someone who is a manager. And I want to focus on micromanaging, or maybe let's say we want the leaders to learn to trust their direct reports or something like that. So I said, write a story about an employee who's struggling because she's being micromanaged by a manager. So then it wrote me this really...
I'm just going to change the look so that perhaps the text's a bit bigger.
Yeah. I can also zoom into my screen on this tab.
I think that works. Okay.
Great. So anyway, so it wrote me a really long scenario, and because ChatGPT is awesome and I can have a conversation with it, I can say, okay, rewrite the scenario, but in the present tense, and end the scenario with the paragraph where it's affecting the main character's well-being. So I don't want the conclusion of the story. I want it to stop at a certain point. That's kind of like going to make the story relevant. So then it rewrote my entire conversation for me, and it stopped at the thing where I said well-being, which was fantastic. And then I said, so let's say in the instructional design process, or let's say you've your class or your learners really well, and you can start creating learner profiles. So learner profiles are personalities that you create that summarize what you know about your learners. So the data that you have, like what their ages are, what their interests are, what their motivations are, what their roles are, stuff like that. So it's a kind of a condensed profile of who your learner is. So a learner profiles are then anchors. So what I did then is I said, here are my 2 anchors. So I said, here's Lisa's profile. So Lisa's one of my anchors and John is another anchor. So I said, I want you to rewrite the scenario twice. One, in the first scenario, Lisa is the bad guy in the story. And in the second scenario, John is the bad guy in the story. And then it wrote me my story over here. And it got really creative with the original story, and it added all kinds of dynamics that were relevant for John. So if I had like learner profiles, I could even like make a separate learning journey or a separate learning track for people like John, so that John can empathize with the manager who's really struggling. And then it wrote another one, or sorry, I said Lisa, and then the second one is where John is the bad guy, and it's absolutely incredible how it rewrites the scenario in such a way that the two characters can still find it relevant to their role. And the key thing here is these anchors, and I think that's going to be really important for us in the long term. When we start developing learning experiences or anything, is we have to find things like these anchors that'll make sure that our stuff is consistent or valuable to the greater learning experience. Karen, did I miss anything here? Do you have any follow-up questions?
So Sarah's got a question. She says, how mindful is chat of the POPI Act or privacy concerns? So do you want to start, and then I'll add to what you say?
Yeah. So I don't know how ChatGPT is using the stuff we're writing into the boxes. So we can assume that they are doing whatever they want with it. So I'm pretty sure that they have a user what's the
policy,
end user agreement or something that says whatever you type in here is our data now. We can do whatever we want with it, and they probably are going to use everything we write as training data. So we have to assume that whatever we do, we are not using it for free. We are giving it information about ourselves and about our behavior with the chatbot. And the other thing I'll add is GPT at least used open source data that was from a big database that they were allowed to use. So they didn't necessarily steal information. They went to a big library of information that has been used for years by researchers. So that's maybe a thing that's relevant here. The one thing that you should be careful with, though, is if you are working in an environment where you have sensitive data that, let's say you've got a testimonial from a learner that is maybe very sensitive, and it has identifiable information about them that some tech person in the database can go and search and maybe find out who this person is. That can be a concern. So make sure that if you are typing something in, it's as if you could have typed it into LinkedIn and hit publish, and you wouldn't have gotten in trouble with your organization.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. So from a conscious point of view, I don't think the chatbot is aware of POPI. It might be able to tell you what it is, but if you start putting names in, it doesn't necessarily realize whether it's a real name or not a real name. And I think just from an ethical point of view, we shouldn't be creating real personas. So these profiles that William's showing you, they non-existent. They just pretend characters. And I think that's how we've got to think about it as well, that you're working in a space where you're putting information in and it's giving you information back that's basically going into a public space. And I think, like William said, I think I read something like that in the terms and agreements, that you sort of are, whatever you're using sort of gets put back into the pool to help to teach the computer. Effectively, what they're doing is they're using us to help us train their computer. That's what if you think about it from that point of view.
And at the moment, there are 100 million people who are using it to or like training it, which is pretty incredible and scary.
It is. All of that, all in one. Yeah.
The other thing I can show off is a scenario. This is maybe a bit not 100% relevant, but it could be interesting. So I convinced, I don't know why it's not loading. So I managed to convince ChatGPT to pretend to be a robot or like a conversational tool. So I asked it to pretend to be someone named Bob, and Bob was going to help me to make sure that training is actually needed. Because a big problem in instructional design is that people often create a course that doesn't actually solve a problem. So before you create your training intervention, you have to make sure that there is a reason for it to exist. And there's a really amazing framework by Megan Pipe where they have a bunch of reflective or questions that you ask, and based on the answers, it proposes a different, it helps you to decide whether training should happen, whether something is what's called a performance problem. So are people not doing what they are supposed to do, and is it really like important to fix that? And if they aren't doing it, and if training can solve the problem, then you can do the training. So what I did is I told it to pretend to be a robot, to pretend to have a conversation with me and ask questions, and then I would respond, and then it would give me relevant questions so that we can work together to find the solution and to figure out if training was actually needed. So I said that it has to pretend to be an advanced chatbot named Bob, and it's supposed to ask me questions. So I gave it some information about what the model is that it's going to use, and then I said, start the conversation with this prompt. So then I started the conversation and it says, hi, I'm Bob. Can you tell me about your organization's performance problem? So then I made up a story about how our sales team wasn't doing what it's supposed to do, and then it kept asking me questions according to the framework that I gave it earlier in my context. And it's amazing how it follows the model. So it said, okay, and then it asked questions for the next step. And then I added some more information. And then here it says, is the problem even worth fixing? And then I said, yes, because we're losing a lot of money, so we have to fix it. And then it says, okay, we should probably fix that. And then it says, do you have clear expectations? So this is another thing that the model prescribes that we ask. So then it said, yes. I said, yes, there are expectations because the sales team last year did as well, or did really well, and they had the same expectations. Nothing's changed. And then it said, okay, well, sorry. So eventually it kept asking me more questions. And then we figured out through this conversation that a bunch of new sales staff joined our team, and they haven't been taught some core skills. Oh my goodness, sorry.
So if I listen to here, two things. By your responses, were you trying to stop it drifting? So were you consciously doing that in terms of your responses, or?
Actually, the amazing thing is that it stuck on theme for a really long time, and it didn't drift off. And I think that's because the initial prompt was quite strong. It had a very clear expectation of how it was supposed to behave. Okay, can you excuse me for a second? I'm just going to kick the dogs out the room.
So for those of you who are watching, if you think about this, if you've played within ChatGPT and you think about how you could use it, we're going to end the session by looking at how we can create a little lesson scenario or put things together. But we would love your comments. We've had somebody said, are there science teachers in the room? But if anybody's got thoughts on how you might, or you've got an idea of what you might want to look at a topic roundabout, and perhaps you give us some prompts that you put in the comments and we can play with those, we'd love to do that as well. So, hi, William, you're back.
Sorry about that.
No.
It's like the time when it's load shedding, so everyone's walking their dogs down the road, and then that drives my dogs nuts. Sorry about
No worries.
that. Yeah, so anyways, I'll just quickly skip over what happened. So then Bob kept asking me more questions, and eventually we figured out what the problem was. And then I said, okay, now that we know what the problem is, can you recommend a goal? And then we came up with a goal, and then it recommended learning objectives, which are fantastic. And then I said, rewrite them as special learning objectives called performance objectives. And then it rewrote them as that. And then I said, okay, please recommend me, now that we've got all this stuff, can you recommend a course outline based on this analysis we've just done? And because we've got performance objectives, and because I asked it to put it into like a table for me, so this framework that I'm using here is called constructive alignment, where you make sure that your learning objectives, your learning activities, and what you teach learners are always aligned with one another. So I asked it to render it like the lesson plan as a table, so that I can have like a clear idea of what the outline is. And then we were able to work together to write this nice little course outline. And then I said, take this entire conversation we had and write me a report where you do three things. You describe the performance problem, justify why it's appropriate, and describe how the training will work. And then it went and wrote an entire report based on this conversation that we had. And then I could copy that and email it to a stakeholder who has to sign the checkbook to approve the training. But what's amazing to me is that this whole process felt really natural. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like I had to make it do certain things or whatever. It was just, this entire report was the result of a conversation we had. And there's no drifting, or there's very little drifting. So here it even remembers that the reason for the training is because we're losing $300,000, and there's a 10% decrease in sales revenue, and it remembers our entire conversation and just distills it so well. So this is one way that, like, going back to my idea earlier of sticking to the processes. So here I used a very popular framework that has been used for years, and it's been iterated and refined because it works. So it's best practices. So why don't we use those best practices just in new ways? Why don't we enhance them instead of trying to replace them altogether?
That is really good advice. So if I could throw you in the deep end now for the last few minutes, should we go through a process of, if you're using it for the first time, where do we even begin?
I think one really good resource is there's a website called Learn Prompting. It's a little short course that you can do for free. I'll quickly. It's called learnprompting.org. One URL, and it has a little mini course that you can do, and it explains how everything works and gives you some advice on how you can use it. And it's got like beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels and stuff like that. I 100% recommend that little mini course.
Oh, wow. So here, if I share my screen, let's see if I can share this. So I'm assuming it's this one.
I think it's, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got easy, what matters, moonshot. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And then at Eduflow Academy, we created also a mini course that you can join for free. It's also about generative AI, and it's more of an exploration. So we introduce a few tools, and then we work together to see how they can fit into the instructional design process. You also alluded earlier to creating something. I don't know if we have time, but if you, I'm happy to stick around if you want to try it out.
So we've got about 5 minutes. But yeah, well, let's just share here's the Eduflow Academy one. Is this right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So also, as William said, it's a free course. It's only 1 to 2 hours long, and it's self-paced. So if you want to explore the topics in a really interactive way, go and explore this little course as well. Cool. So let's
Awesome.
see. How do we start? Can I pop
Okay.
up the screen?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know if anyone in the chat here has any like ideas for a lesson that they're really struggling with. It could be like Shakespeare or something. So we don't necessarily even have to like create something. I can just explain like the process. But the important thing is to work on our anchor. So we'll have to find our learning objective first, and we don't even have to necessarily write the learning objective, like we were taught. We can just describe our problem, that or the thing that we want learners to be able to do, and then ask it to write a learning objective for us. So we can say something like, let's say, just do. I'm doing a. I would say I'm planning an English lesson about Shakespeare. I can't. I'm not even spelling it right. And I want learners to be able to describe the plot of Twelfth Night or something. Can you recommend learning objectives? Yeah. So then it'll. Okay, we broke it. And this will happen at this time of the day because the
Americans are waking up.
Yeah, the Americans are all up now and they're all playing around with this tool and they're using it. So we kind of have to take a back seat.
Before you go away from this, I think there are a couple of cool things here that we can think about. One, the way you describe it, in terms of the context and what you're wanting to achieve, is very important. So you build a really great context within that, and then you ask it what you want it to do. So giving it background and information before you actually put the question in, I think, is very important.
Yeah. I mean, we can treat this as like a conversation, right? So now when we've got our learning objectives, I can say, okay, well, I've got a learning objectives. I've got this much time, so we give it more context. So I've got this much time. I've got this many learners in my class. This is the format of the class. So we can say it's over Zoom, and I have access to a quiz activity and a poll activity, and this and this and this. And then I can say recommend a lesson plan, include timings and everything for my lesson. Using these tools, and put it out as a table, and it'll write me a table, like a really nice formatted lesson plan that'll achieve the objective that we set out. And it's a nice starting point. We can then tweak it and stuff, but it's a really nice brainstorming tool.
Cool. I'm going to pop your screen down. Sarah's got quite a long statement. She's saying, I think it is imperative to understand the space as our children are more okay with the technology than we realize. Perhaps the school, regardless of the stage, needs to introduce this with scaffolding so the children establish a way of being safe when engaging the space. And Sarah, I agree with you completely. I really think that the safety around it is imperative. I think ChatGPT does have an age restriction on it, if I remember correctly. I think it was 18 or something quite high, if I remember. But that doesn't mean the kids aren't going to play in it. And so it's creating the awareness, and not saying that schools shouldn't be saying, oh, we're just going to ban it, or it's not going to be there, or it's not going to affect us. I think as teachers, we need to be aware of the tech and think about how we can actually benefit from it.
That's such a good point. I agree with you 100%. And I really like Sarah's suggestion of scaffolding, because I think it's going to be, we can't necessarily like immediately tell them about the policies and why it's bad. We have to kind of ease them into the entire space, and kind of step by step scaffold it. And that's why I really like that history example, because it's an excellent scaffold, because it encourages people to firsthand figure out why it's so flawed, or how it's so flawed.
Exactly.
And an exercise like that in the K through 12 space could also be amazing.
Yeah, and I think you could even purposefully use the AI and create a situation where you're saying put errors in,
Definitely.
and then use it from that point of view. But it goes back to what you were talking about, I think, at the beginning, in terms of making sure that as teachers we are aware of the tech and how we are using it, and go back and check. Don't just think of it as gospel and that it's true, you know. For me, I was looking for the image now, but I can't find it. But for me, what showed it really clearly was the one where one of the image AIs created the picture of hands and hands shaking, and how you could just see that it had no idea what hands were, because you've got three hands holding, you've got hands that almost the wrists and the way the arms are folding. So it's taken the words and it's made pictures, but the pictures are all just not the way human bodies work at all. And I think just if we just aware of that in terms of text and things like that, it's the same.
That's such a great point. Yeah.
So William, as we end off, what would you like to leave as a tip for people?
My tip is to really think about the way you were doing things before and why you were doing them in that way, and go down into the process and the workflow and start from there. Try not to necessarily replace your process. Think about how you can enhance it. Those core principles are going to be very important in the next few years. Just like a manager is really good at asking questions because they have their own core principles that help them to ask the right questions or to manage people in the right way. We have to stick to them. It'll help us to anchor ourselves, I guess, in best practices.
I just want to say thank you so much for your time this evening and for sharing. That was really wonderful, just the tips and the ideas that you gave us all in terms of how we should be considering AI, and just ideas in terms of beginning to play as teachers and have the discussions in your staff rooms. Don't all just go, I did all my lesson prep. Think about, is it effective? Is this really going to meet the needs of my kids? Have I prompted accurately? And is the information it's putting there accurate for me to actually share with other people? Don't just get it to write a letter and don't read it and send it. There's a good chance that it's not exactly what you want. So thanks very much, William. I'm going to end the call. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.